Well, I guess we'll get started here. So I just want to welcome you to our Next Big Thing podcast. So joining me today is Carine Kanimba. So she's the daughter of Paul Rusesabagina, whose story has been portrayed in the award-winning movie Hotel Rwanda. And you're joining me all the way today from Belgium. So Carine, just thank you again for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
So, we all know, your father's story has been famously portrayed in the movie Hotel Rwanda, which we will get to later on. But, my question is, looking at the case and looking at what's currently going on, how does a person who has been so well admired globally for so many years is now a person who's currently on trial for alleged terrorism and murder charges? Like, how does that how does that happen?
Yeah, so it's been a long journey to say the least. So essentially, since the movie Hotel Rwanda was released, the government of Rwanda has seen my father as a threat, specifically Paul Kagame, the current president of Rwanda. Initially, he appreciated the film. He liked the movie. He offered my father positions within his government, and wanted him to be part of the team and to continue the narrative that the current of the Rwandan genocide, of the history of Rwanda, the narrative that the Rwandan government wants the world to know rather than what actually happened. My father did not want to go along with this narrative and instead used his newly gained platform to expose the human rights abuses going on in Rwanda, being committed by the current Rwandan government, by the current president of Rwanda, not only in Rwanda, but in the Great Lakes region of Africa, and all the murders and the deaths that we know are happening in the Congo. And so he shed light on it with his platform. And so the president of Rwanda has gone out of his way to smear my father, to try to first ruin his reputation, to change his image, and then to lock him up and silence him forever. So it started off with in a very strange way. It's only so the movie Hotel Rwanda was released 10 years after the genocide so the genocide was in 1994, and the movie was released in 2004. So only 10 years after, once the movie gained success, once my father got the medal, received Medal of Freedom by George W. Bush, and all the other attention that followed, that's when Paul Kagame decided to change the narrative and start accusing my father of being a liar, of being a murderer, or cheater, or genocide denier, all kinds of things. And so the reason why now he's gone from being known as the hero to now what the government of Rwanda wants him to be known as is because of that smear campaign that they've been working out for so many years in trying to discredit him, to silence him so that he stops exposing the violations being committed by the current government.
And you've been open about the fact that these allegations are false. Like you believe that these are not true. Um, and depending on what the evidence brings forward, it may or may not constitute him a fair trial. What do you think would constitute your father a fair trial, especially in Rwanda?
Yes, so I'd like to first start with the first part of your question in relation to the false charges. So it's not the first time that they bring about false charges against my father. As I said, immediately after the movie was released, they first started off by being welcoming and offering him positions, and then because he refused and he continued to speak up, they started accusing him of being a genocide denier and a genocide ideologist, and that did not work because he had just made a movie about the genocide, and he spends the majority of his time going from different schools, universities, conferences, talking about the lessons of the genocide, and so those accusations didn't fit. And so next they tried to assassinate him. So there were assassination attempts against his life here in Belgium. They would go and harass him at different events and conferences where he would speak at. They broke into our home here in Brussels several times and destroyed everything, but it didn't take anything of value. They just stole documents in Kenya, Rwanda. There's a picture of George Bush and my father in the living room, and they moved it and like threw it on the ground. And so it was just a message to us essentially. After the assassination attempt and the house break-ins and the intimidations, they accused him of funding rebel groups in the Congo. They brought falsified receipts to the American authorities and to the Belgian authorities, and said that he was sending money from Texas to the Congo because they knew we had a home in Texas. But they made a mistake in the falsification, and the Western Union receipts that they falsified, they said that the date that they chose, my father was actually in Ireland and not in Texas. And so again, this was easy to prove and to say like these again are lies. And so at the same time actually that they did this, my father had just sent a letter to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, asking them to investigate Paul Kagame for his crimes in the Congo for the past 20 years. And so this is all basically in response to his continued advocacy, his continued actions, and their attempt to silence him through false charges that we've continued to disprove and continue to explain that they were wrong. In regards to the fair trial, Rwanda does not have an independent justice system. In Rwanda, Paul Kagame decides. It is a dictatorship. It's been, I mean, there's countless human rights organizations, countries, institutions that have condemned Rwanda for the human rights violations, for the repressive regime, for the lack of the freedom of expression, of political participation, and just there's many problems that we could begin to construct. But it's known that this is the type of regime that that it is, and that the justice system is not independent. My father was kidnapped to Rwanda. So that was in violation of international law, that there was no legal extradition procedures. There was no international warrant against his arrest. This was a full out kidnapping and he was dragged across international borders. He was drugged on the private plane that the Rwandan government chartered to bring him from Dubai to Rwanda. Upon arriving in Rwanda, he was tied up by the hands, the legs, and blindfolded, and covered his mouth, and kept him in an undisclosed location for 3 days, tied up like this. And so he is almost 70 years old, and so that like all this, the illegality of that kidnapping, that torture, all of it in and of itself is already a violation of international law. So you can't even expect a trial from that basis alone, a fair trial from that basis alone. But then it gets even worse. From the moment he's arrived in Kigali in Rwanda, where they forcefully took him, they have deprived them of virtually almost every basic human rights. He's not being allowed to be represented by his chosen lawyers, the lawyers of his choice. They've been denied access to him countless times, and they're still fighting to try to go to court, to go to Rwanda to represent him today. They've deprived him of his medication. We sent medication through the Belgian diplomatic suitcase, because my father is a Belgian citizen, to him. They were delivered to the prison, but they were never handed to him. On top of this, the Rwandan government and the Minister of Justice admitted that they're systematically confiscating my father's confidential documents that his Rwandan lawyer brings him to the prison, which are usually protected through client and attorney privilege and confidentiality, and they're just taking it, confiscating it from him, reading everything, and that all of it, which includes his strategy of defense, and then sometimes never give it back to him. Sometimes they give him pieces of it. So there cannot be a fair trial on from the kidnapping to everything that's happened to him since then. It's just crazy to expect that there's a fair trial. And just as a final point, the president, Paul Kagame, went on national television on his first week or second week after the kidnapping in September of 2020, and basically said that he had blood on his hands. He said that my father had blood on his hands, that he was guilty essentially, and he admitted to the kidnapping and by saying that he was lured, or that it was a flawless operation. And so knowing that this is a dictatorship, and knowing that anyone who opposes this dictatorship is either killed, jailed, or disappeared, there is no way anyone would dare to speak up to oppose what the government, what the president, the dictator said. And so there is no chance of my father having a fair trial.
And what do you think specifically about the trial, or about the case, or perhaps about your father, that has gained the international attention that it has now, because it's been covered internationally? So what do you think in particular is gaining the attention?
Yeah, so I think it's because first my father, because of the movie Hotel Rwanda, which is up until today, a lot of people know about the Rwandan genocide because of the movie. At least a lot of people who weren't alive at the time, because the movie brought uh, attention to the history, brought knowledge for them. I mean, a lot of schools across the United States have to study my father's autobiography titled "An Ordinary Man" as part of the curriculum for studying genocide. So it's something that people are familiar with his story, familiar with his heroism during the genocide and saving the lives of more than 1,200 people by sheltering them in his hotel. And so he's also not only done this, which is an incredible, courageous act, but he's also continued to speak up throughout his entire life, because even before the genocide, he was speaking up against the previous government. During the genocide, he protected people. And after the genocide, he realized that things are still not the same. In his book, in his autobiography, he says um, that the music has changed. Sorry, the dances have changed, but the music remained the same. And so this is directly saying that the current government is no better than the one before. And so he's continued to expose this. He's continued to be one of the very few people who fearlessly stood up against Paul Kagame, and that Paul Kagame had been unsuccessful at silencing until this point. And so not only that history, but also the fact that that it was a kidnapping and it was across. I mean, there was 3 countries involved. This becomes not only about my father, but also about the act of transnational repression of the country going across international borders into another country to take a person against their will. This is something that involves all countries. If anyone that is signed, that has signed international treaties and that are meant to respect these types of rules. And then to finally, my father, the government of Rwanda want to make an example out of my father. They want to make sure that no one dares to criticize him, no to criticize the government of Rwanda today, that no one dares to call out the human rights abuses, by sending the message that they can go anywhere, kidnap you, take you, and no one will protect you. No one will speak up, even if you have fled that country to seek asylum or refugee, to be a refugee in another country. And so it's a clear message, and I think this is why it has brought a lot of attention.
And you've briefly touched on the fact that your father was outspoken before, even before the 1994 genocide. Like he was already very much outspoken about human rights activism and etc. Talk a little bit about that, though. Has his role changed? Since the movie came out. Like, what was he like before 1994?
Yeah, so before 94, and this is the kind of the very interesting part about my father, is that he's always been very principled. He's always been, he had a very strict education. His father has always insisted on being, of all his children, of all his kids being kind of perfectionist and doing everything right. And he was born in, I mean, he grew up in a very, very poor family. He was, tended cattle and he had to do a lot of work to support his parents and his brothers and sisters. And until he was able to, he first wanted to be, he studied theology. He wanted to be a priest, and then realized that theology wasn't for him, and that he wanted to do hotel school or hotellerie, or I forgot the term now. Yes, it's hotel management. Thank you. And so then he got a scholarship to study in Switzerland and in Kenya, and he kind of learned, I think, through this kind of, he became even more of a perfectionist. Where growing up with him, we always had to, when I set the table, for instance, like everything has to be perfect. There's no glass can be farther than where it should be. It has always been like very things. There's right and there's wrong, and there's no in between. So basically for him. And so it's always been very specific about how things, in terms of his principles and how he sees the world. And so before the genocide, He already was the manager of the Hotel de Mille Collines, the Diplomat Hotel, which was another hotel owned by the same group as the Hotel de Mille Collines. And they hosted a lot of events there, and so not only as a manager, he was hiring people on both ethnic groups. Rwanda has both Tutsis and Hutus, and so there's two major ethnic groups. And so for him, while at the time there was a lot of discrimination against the Tutsis, he hired a lot of Tutsis, and so he was caricaturized in the local newspapers as for doing that, or for hiring Tutsis and Hutus. And for him, he saw no difference. And so for everybody was equal. We're all Rwandans. Everybody is, if you can work, then you can provide, you can do the job. And not only this, but he's also married to a Tutsi woman. He's adopted my sister and I. So he's always been very open, and he himself comes from a Tutsi mother and a Hutu father. And so he's always been a unifying figure within the Rwandan community. But he's also at one point during an event at the hotel, this was where the previous president attended, and there was a lot of people from international people at the hotel, and this is where a lot of the events would take place. The former president staff came through the hotel and told everyone to wear a pin of the president's party. My father, who did not agree with that party and who did not agree with the politics, and who was already an outspoken advocate against the politics, refused to wear that pin. Everyone else in the hotel was forced to do it, but he refused. So he ended up being obviously punished by the government. Before, he was made to report every single day to the cabinet, where the chief of the presidential police office was, and he had to be beaten up every single day, and he had to report back the next day to be beaten up because he refused to do it. And back then, that was the type of punishment that they would do, and he would just, until eventually they realized that he wasn't going to change, so they gave up. So that back then he already took a stand. And then in 1994, his conscience told him that he couldn't leave the people in the hotel knowing that being there is what had protected them thus far. He didn't feel, although when he had the opportunity with the family to leave and to go to Europe, to Belgium, during the genocide, he refused because he realized that leaving would mean that a lot of the people who were still sheltered in the hotel would be killed. And again, after the genocide, as the current government of Rwanda has done countless killings and countless kidnappings and imprisoning critics and innocent people, he couldn't stay silent, especially with the newly gained platform of Hotel Rwanda that allowed him to have his voice heard, to have the message passed on. And to conclude the answer to your question, after the movie came out, not only did he gain a new platform to continue for his voice to be more propelled and be heard across the world, a lot of people would also continue to come to the house asking him for help. I think I grew up seeing many people on weekly and daily basis just coming and telling them their problems, or saying, well, my son was kidnapped, I don't know what to do, I know he was in Rwanda, he opposed the government, and some things like that. And he just, with all this knowledge, he wasn't going to sit down and not do anything about it. So he said he used his platform to bring light to the issues that have been going on, and the violations of human rights going on in Rwanda.
And he was, like you said before, he was deemed a hero in 1994 because he was able to save people, 1,200 people in the hotel, and he was able to, provide them with the basic necessities in the hotel as well at the time. Do you think that there was a control of that narrative of how your father's role actually impacted the people of Rwanda? Like, was there like only a certain story that Rwanda wanted the people to know?
Yes. So that's exactly the problem in Rwanda today when it comes to the narrative of the Rwandan genocide, is that the government of Rwanda today and the RPF, which is the Rwandan Patriotic Front, that's the party, the leadership, the Kagame's political party, and that used to be armed forces, and are still is actually as part of the Rwandan army today. They So the story of the genocide is that during 100 days after the previous president Habyarimana was killed, that set into motion 100 days of systematic extermination by the extremist Hutus called Interahamwe, trying to exterminate the Tutsi minority. And that is truly what happened. And including my biological parents were killed during the genocide, and they were victims of that too. However, throughout that 100 days, so the 1994 genocide started in the middle of the war. There was a war that had started in 1990 because of the invasion of current president's rebel army at the time to invade. So his rebel army started invading Rwanda in 1990 because they wanted to be part of the political space and he wanted to be represented. And so by that time, a lot of crimes had already been committed and a lot of crimes throughout the war by the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or President Kagame's army. But there was also a lot of crimes being committed by the previous government. During the genocide, we know that their extermination was done by the extremist Hutus trying to exterminate the Tutsis. But during the genocide and after the genocide, as the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or Paul Kagame's army that invaded their country, eventually were able to win the genocide, win the war, and take over the country and the power of the presidency. But on their way, they killed a lot of innocent Hutus and Tutsis, actually, but a lot of innocent Hutus. And there's plenty of, the UN has done research and investigation into the systematic extermination committed by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the current president Paul Kagame. And so what Paul Kagame wanted is that he wanted to be the hero, the one who ended the genocide. And so not only what did he want to be the hero, but also this is the narrative that he has wanted the entire world to know since 1994, is that the RPF arrived, the genocide ended, when actually on their arrival, they were also committing war crimes and leaving dead bodies in the back. So then you fast forward to 2004, where my father, the movie, I mean, immediately after the genocide, a lot of people wrote books, the people who were survivors of the genocide. I mean, the directors and the producers of Hotel Rwanda also did a lot of investigations of the people who survived in the genocide. And so all of this information and the film was based on a true story. And so fast forward to 2004, while the narrative of Paul Kagame and his army saving and ending the genocide was the narrative that the world was accepting to know. Now you have a new hero in the picture, and now another man who single-handedly saved 1,268 people. And so Paul Kagame at first appreciated it. He loved the movie. He offered, as I said, positions for my father. But my father, who I said has always stood up for his principles, refused. And so now my father was also gaining an international platform. And so seeing the fact that another man is now being represented, another man is being recognized as the hero, is what the narrative that Paul Kagame doesn't want, especially another man who's part of the Hutu majority, or what he has throughout the past 20 years tried to make out to be the enemy for all of Rwandans. And so that narrative, that's essentially the issue of the narrative, where my father has said, well, we need to have a true investigation into the war crimes committed during that period, while at the same time exposing the continued human rights abuses being committed by this government. While Paul Kagame wanted to, at first accepted my father's heroism, but when he realized that my father was speaking up against him and was exposing his violation, decided to smear him. And so that's when the attacks against my father's life started. That's when they tried to make him out to be a liar, a killer, a genocidaire, all types of things. And so this is why now what we have today, as much as it is about the lies and the falsified information and the falsified accusations that the Rwandan government wants to bring onto my father in order to silence him, it is very much about the battle of narrative and Paul Kagame wanting to remain that one and only hero of the genocide, when it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive.
Right. And the reason why I asked about the specific narrative, or perhaps like you said, this battle of who is in control of the narrative, Um, the reason is because there's this other side of the story, where the former colleagues of your father were interviewed. I think it was recently, where they say now that actually, in fact, he wasn't this hero that people say he was, or perhaps he didn't save as many people, etc. There was also another quote here that says, he after he's received the medals and recognition, he thought that he was as big as President Paul Kagame. What do you think now? There's this shift of opinion. There's this shift of people that are now saying, okay, well, he's actually not. He's not this hero that people think that he is or was.
Yeah, so this has started since 2005. So the movie Hotel Rwanda was released in 2004, about a year after my father started refusing the offers of the Rwandan government and exposing him. The Rwandan government went out of its way to not only locate everyone that was in the hotel, to either threaten them, to offer them money, positions, to change their story, change their narratives. Even one of my father's really, really best friends, my mom and dad's really best friends, she's even the godmother to my sister. I mean, they're like soup, they were really close, but the woman worked for Paul Kagame's government. I think she was one of the chief of staff, or I mean, actually a senator. She was a senator herself. And so being in Rwanda in the government of Paul Kagame, and then also siding with my father, they've went straight to her and has made her change her entire story and the way who my father is, and makes him out to be evil as well, when this woman has known my father for a very long time and they were best friends. Actually, my parents organized her son's graduation party after college. So it's like, it's crazy how they can get into the middle of friends and family just to try to isolate and alienate and annihilate people. But so this is the change, and this the reason why I think that change of story is important to pay attention to, is the timing of it. They had 10 years. My father was already known between 1994 and 2004. They had 10 years to challenge hotel, what happened at the hotel. They had 10 years to counter my father's story. They had 10 years, even when the movie Hotel Rwanda was being produced. They welcomed the filming of the movie. They welcomed and facilitated a lot of the meetings with the people at the Hotel de Mille Collines. They were happy about the story because they know it's true. And then on top of this, immediately after the genocide, the 1994 genocide, a lot of people wrote, who were at the hotel or were familiar with the story, wrote their autobiographies, wrote their books, wrote their stories, their memories of the genocide, and all of it is fresh memory because those were written immediately after the genocide. And there has been a lot of research again into the movie, into my father's story and what happened and so on. Now, the change in narrative and the change in the story of what happened, and people was all of a sudden saying that my father wasn't as good as was when Paul Kagame started speaking out against my father. When Paul Kagame started the smear campaign against him, and again, I think at one point my father wrote a response to the Rwandan government released a book that says that tries to say what has happened inside of Hotel Rwanda. And so they went into the prisons of Rwanda to look for convicted genocidaires or genocide perpetrators and ask them to say that somehow my father had been in contact with them, that they knew each other or something. And one of them signed a testimony saying that they had made her say these things. And so that was another thing to prove that they're just going really out of their ways to make people change their stories. It's very unfortunate because my father is really, I mean, he's done a good act. He saved people, and he doesn't even consider himself a hero. That's why the title of his book is An Ordinary Man. He's always said that if anybody was in that position, they would have done the same thing, is that he was lucky to have the hotel, to be managing the hotel, and to have plenty of open rooms. So why not allow people to be there? And he was, so it's very sad that this is the way they decided to change the narrative. But the fact is, because this is simply this, that's the very, very saddest part, is that this is about ego, about jealousy, and about the fact that my father somehow got the attention that they did not want him to have.
And you've spoken about the fact that, after the movie's release, 10 years after the genocide, he had this new platform where he could be able to, he was able to speak out about human rights, and he was able to also speak out about the government, specifically Paul Kagame's government. Um, but I think my question here is like, do you think he felt any pressure to sort of live up to that stardom and that newfound recognition that people are now recognizing him, that okay, he did this, and now he's a hero? Do you think he felt any pressure to live up to that?
I don't think so, because I think he has always been that person.
Okay.
He has always been, he has stayed consistent in his route. Like, I think this is what I meant by his perfectionism as a hotel manager, is that he's always been about being righteous and doing what's right and respecting people in the way that they should be respected, and serving people in the way that they should be served. And he's always and even in the conversations that he told us with his parents growing up, he's always been that person. It's just that now he had been recognized and he had been seen, and so he continued. And I think he also felt like he had a responsibility. I think knowing that this attention doesn't come, it shouldn't be wasted. And he did not waste it. He really did not remain silent and continued to use his voice, continued to bring attention. And it would have been, I think, in his mind, would have been actually a lack of respect, of accountability to oneself, when you know that you have such a platform, such attention, and not use it to bring about change in the people that need your voice. And so I don't think he tried to live up to it. I think that's who he is. He's just remained who he was, and has just put now a spotlight on his head.
Mm. Earlier, you talked about the fact that your father was offered a position in Paul Kagame's government, to which your father declined. Like, your father didn't want to be in that position. Why do you think he was reluctant, or why do you think he declined that? Wouldn't that have given him a bigger platform to perhaps continue his activism?
Yes, but the government of Rwanda had not done what he calls a real truth and reconciliation process among the Rwandan people. What I meant earlier about the fact that the Rwandan government came in during the genocide, at the end of the genocide, and not only, yes, ended the genocide, but killed people on their way. A lot of the people that were killed by the Rwandan government are not acknowledged until this day. Some family members are not even allowed to mourn their family's deaths, because those people were killed by the current government. And by pointing to it means that you're directly challenging their leadership, their sense of power, and even their integrity. And so my father refused, not only because he was aware of those war crimes, and he would not have worked for a man or a person who he knew is responsible of such war crimes, but he also wanted a real truth and reconciliation process. He thought that we needed to say the truth, to set the record straight about what happened during the genocide, and before and after, in order to have a real dialogue with the people of Rwanda, and be able to put the past behind us and move together in the future in a democratic way. And this is not the way the Kagame regime does it. And so he refused, because he thought that he did not align with those values.
Mm. And after the recognition of the movie, as we said earlier, your father has had this almost like an international platform now, a global platform, where he could continue to share his story about Hotel Rwanda, globally, that sort of thing. But it seemed as though he wasn't afraid to be critical of Paul Kagame's government. Like, he was openly critical about the ways that it could have, the government could have been doing things better, etc. Um, did your, I guess, my question is, did your father understand the risk, or perhaps the danger of being openly critical about Paul Kagame's government? Did he know that, he's putting himself in potential danger?
Yes, I think he was very conscious of that. And I think this is part of what gives me strength today to know who it is that he knows who it is that he was challenging, that he knew he was poking a bear. And this was not and he's always thought that, again, it was his responsibility. In terms of the fear aspect, I mean, I know they've broken into our home, they've tried to assassinate him into on the road, they've tried to put child pornographic material in his laptop, although they failed, and we filed a complaint, and they weren't able to successfully do this. They wanted to do that so that they could report him to the FBI, but as soon as we came across this knowledge, he reported it, and they never succeeded. But they've tried, he's known that, I mean, the type of evil that can have content and bring it and put it in somebody else's laptop with the hopes of having them arrested. I mean, this is only one part, but they're killers, they're murderers. He knows he knows the number of people that come to him telling him about the murders. He's seen pictures and images. They've tried to assassinate him. So he knows exactly who it is that he was dealing with. I think my thing is he was afraid for us, mostly for his children, and that's why he decided to move us to the United States to study in the US, and that's essentially after our house was broken into. That's when he decided to purchase a home in Texas, in a gated community where at least we could be safe, and even if he continued to travel, that at least he knew that we were in security. In his conferences and his travels, they've harassed him, they've sent people to challenge him, to smear him. I mean, they've been doing this for over 15 years, yet he was never intimidated. I think he knew that his voice was the fact that they were coming after him to try to silence him means that he had a message to spread, and it was an important one and needed to be heard. And he's also always considered that every day since 1994 was a gift to him, because he felt that he was not going to survive the genocide. I mean, he was directly challenging evil genocidaires and extremists who had a lot of blood on their hands physically. And so I think he always felt that not only could he die at any moment because of the people that he's challenging and the fight that he's the struggle that he's leading, but also because he had a responsibility, he had a voice, had a platform, and not using it would have been just as bad.
Mm. You pointed out the fact that he wasn't intimidated by the fact that the government was constantly in a way coming after him. Whether he was living in the US or Belgium, he wasn't intimidated by that. But were you, being a family member of this, were you ever concerned about your safety and your and just concerned about that, like the safety aspect of it?
Yes, when we, I mean, yes, because we always had to be careful every time we've been in our home here in Belgium, because we knew that at one point the Rwandan government had purchased, maybe 10 years ago, had rented a house a few house doors down from us, and we'd see them following us, trailing us, looking into the window of our house. So the danger was there, and we were conscious, but I think we very much trusted my father. We trusted that he wouldn't put us at risk, and he knew as well that his advocacy and his outspokenness was a sort of protection for him, because he knew that if anything happens to him, people know exactly who did it. And then there is also, I think, for me, it was more the knowledge that they could hurt him at any moment, but we'd never expect that it would be through an international kidnapping and torture and everything that's happened since August. But at the end of the day, I also felt like every single time I've heard him speak at events, every time we've had people come, and I mean, every time he's shared his story or given talks, I mean, he's always, the mission is very clear. We've seen suffering. Rwandan people have suffered enough. Like, I mean, the genocide alone, before the genocide, colonialism, since genocide with the current government of Rwanda, and the level of suffering that they've endured, that we have endured as the people of Rwandan origins, it's sufficient, it's enough, it's more than enough. And so I think with that knowledge and the ability to do something about it, I think I wouldn't, and no one in our family opposes to speaking up against injustice and speaking up for human rights.
You also said, you know, that his outspoken has been a way to perhaps protect you and protect his family. But I feel as though, you know, when he is outspoken, he puts himself, you know, it's almost like he puts himself in danger all the time because he's outspoken all the time, you know.
Yeah, yes, and so that's I think there's a terminology when you said it's a knife with two pointy ends,
Like a
where
double-edged sword.
double-edged swords, yes. So it's so yes, the being public and being very open and critical about Paul Kagame is something that's allowed him to have that protection because he's known to be critical, and people know who the target would be, who the person responsible for hurting him would be. However, you're right, it also brought a lot of problems. It brought a lot of trouble for him because he was the one person that is directly in the way of Paul Kagame and his happy story and happy narrative that involves killing millions of people. And so I think it certainly felt that way, but again, at the end of the day, when you think about the reason for what he was doing, the reason because of people are suffering, because people have had enough of being killed and being ignored, I think a lot of what hurts me the most now actually is more so about in mid-February, the European Union for the first time condemned Rwanda for the human rights abuses, for kidnapping my father, for his enforced disappearance. They asked for an investigation into his illegal arrest, into the legality of his arrest. And then they condemned Rwanda for many other violations of human rights that they've committed over the past X amount of years. And the very sad thing is that this is the things that my father has been fighting for over 20 years. And he had to be a victim of it for the world to also realize, for the world to open their eyes. And so when you think about it, as much trouble as it brought him because he was challenging such evil, it was for the right reasons. It's the suffering the Rwandan people have endured since 1994 and continue to endure under this dictatorship is too much, and people have had enough. And so I think this is essentially what he was trying to call attention to, and it's unfortunate that he had to be a victim of it for the world to finally pay attention to it and condemn Rwanda for all these abuses.
And what do you say to people that you know, suggest that you know, you if it wasn't for your father being outspoken, perhaps he wouldn't have been threatened by the government. He wouldn't have been seen as a threat by the government. You know, what do you say to those people that say he shouldn't have been as outspoken?
So that's the thing. He's tried, I mean, he's attempted to have dialogue with this government at several times. He's tried to bring them to the table to talk about reconciliation, to talk about progress for Rwanda with his perspective and the perspective of the hundreds of thousands of people who he was advocating for. And I think not if he hadn't spoken up, then he wouldn't have been a human rights activist, then he wouldn't have been a humanitarian, then that wouldn't have been his role. He would have been just a dad to us perhaps, and the husband to his wife. And I mean, this is what it is, that this is what he, I mean, and not to just make him less than anything, but no, I think this is who he is, and I think this is not only at its core, like I said, he's been this way since before the genocide. It wasn't new. He was already being characterized before. He's been characterized by this government as well, and so it's just not who he is to stay silent. And so, I mean, perhaps this is the consequences, but this is also in a good and in a really strange way good, because it finally brought the eyes towards this injustice. And it's almost a lot the way that I compare it to, actually, during the genocide, my dad called with the last working telephone in our fax machine in the hotel at the Milkaline. He called everywhere in the world. He called the White House begging for help, begging for people to come and save the Rwandan people from mass extermination. He called the Quai d'Orsay in France. He called the Belgian government here. Anywhere, the UK and the parliament, anywhere that he could, just for anybody to come and help people. But the international community was too comfortable in the knowledge, in refusing to admit that a genocide was going on, and was did not want to have to challenge the evil that they knew was happening on daily basis in Rwanda. We're in the exact same situation today, not only in my father's case, but in relation to the way we deal with Rwanda. People like to believe the success story narrative, that they don't want to look below the surface of all these other testimonies and countless evidence of people being targeted for who they are, for speaking up, for criticizing the government, for journalism, for anything. And so this is a knowledge, this is things, there is plenty of reports that have been published that precisely details all these things. Yet people are uncomfortable with having to challenge that evil that they know exists and that they know is committing crimes on daily basis. So it's the exact same thing that we were dealing with in 1994, that my father spent days and after days trying to beg for help, that we're back in the same situation. And again, people like to just be comfortable with not seeing with not accepting what is right in front of their eyes and letting the suffering persist. So yeah.
And now that the trial is continuing, it's still, it's what is it, day 3 now? It's apparently the trial. So, one of the, I guess one of the potential evidence, I guess, is this video that resurfaced in 2018 about, your father being vocal about the fact that the Rwandan Patriotic Front is apparently, quote, the enemy of the people, and he had, pledged his support, unreserved support for the NLF. What and now it's being, it's a potential evidence that this is probably why he's being charged. So what do you think? Why do you think this video has now resurfaced? 3 years ago now. Like, why do you think this is a video?
Yes, so this video is basically the only thing that the Rwandan government has and is using to try to make my father out to be who he's not. So in this, so my father, as I mentioned, so he's a humanitarian, he's a human rights activist, but throughout his life as well, he realized that those two roles alone would not be enough to be able to bring about change in the way that he felt that those conversations needed to be addressed. So in 2006 or 7, he created the PDR, which is the Parti démocratique pour le Rwanda, or the Rwandan Party for Rwandan Democracy. And the goal there was to bring, not only to have reconciliation talks, to have truth and reconciliation conversations, to have democracy, to have a full-on a real democratic change in Rwanda. And there are many different political parties that were being created across Belgium, across Europe, across Australia, and the US and Africa even, but they were not allowed in Rwanda, because in Rwanda, only one party is allowed that wins by 98% of the votes on the elections. So, I mean, there's not a democracy. So they realized that over the years, there were so many different political parties, and that they all had the same goal and the same idea of bringing about democratic change in Rwanda. So in 2018, they created a coalition, or 2017, they created a coalition of several parties, political parties, that included my father's party and another party that had a self-defense armed wing that is called the FLN. So my father's party is the PDR, Parti Démocratique pour le Rwanda, that joined that coalition of those other parties, and then another party called the CNRD had an armed wing that also joined the coalition. So then when the Rwandan government says that my father created the FLN and created this armed group, it's not true. That group already existed, belonged to another party. They're just trying to make that quick link because they were all part of that same coalition. And then on top of this, so in the video, my father, the video is really much being taken out of context and also being interpreted. It's open to interpretation, but people are making, there's nowhere that he said terrorism, nowhere does he say violence or kill people. This is just the Rwandan government blowing what his few sentences were out of proportion. And they're also picking just that one phrase when he says by any means necessary, because they know that through Malcolm X and the historical meaning of that sentence and all that has had negative connotation, and it's not what he meant. And it definitely, he's always stood up for peace and reconciliation and nonviolence. So this is not who he is. But the most important detail, I think, in terms of his defense, and when we bring up these accusations as well, is that, yes, so he did that video where he just asks people to stand up for their rights. He asked people to say that, I mean, the RPF army has been killing people and is not being right. And this has been documented by hundreds of reports by established organizations. So it wasn't anything new that he was saying. But the most important part of these accusations, and the reason why he's even how corrupt his current being in Rwanda is that the attacks that they're accusing him for, and that they're even saying that he's referring to in that video, have not been investigated. My father and the coalition have been asking from the very moment that these attacks occurred for an independent investigation into these attacks in order to prove that it's not them. But the Rwandan government has refused. And actually, we have more and more evidence that shows that these were false flag operations led by the Rwandan government in order to smear my father, as is what they had been doing for the past 15 years. So this was just another opportunity for them to say, like, look, well, he's also done this, listen to this video, this is when he calls it. And it's complete ludicrous, it's crazy. But so there has not been any investigation into these attacks. Only the Rwandan newspapers and the Rwandan government have said things about it, have published things about it, and all of it directly attacking my father as if he was the link of all of it. And then finally, the few journalists that did go to the location of the attacks immediately after they happened are now sitting in prison in Rwanda. So the only people that were there, that reported on, they are now imprisoned. They're refusing an investigation into these attacks. All they want to do is to say that my father did it and needs to be in prison and silenced forever. So this goes in line with everything they've been doing for the past 20 years. And it's not, it's crazy, but it's very sad that my father is just paying the price of having been there to speak up against injustice.
And why do you think people should believe that your father is innocent? Why do you think people should believe that?
First, because if he was guilty, the Rwandan government would not have needed to kidnap him. They could have brought those evidence, the allegations that they have against him, to the appropriate authorities in the US or in Belgium, as they have done for other people they've accused. There is legal procedure for this. And every time that they do, I mean, it's been approved. The US has extradited four people to Rwanda already and plans to extradite 8 more. Belgium has a cooperation with Rwanda in the judiciary. And so there are mechanisms in place in order to bring somebody to justice to Rwanda. But the decision to kidnap him means that even the allegations and I talked to you about the falsified money receipts earlier. This is not the first time that they bring about falsified evidence and information for other authorities to laugh at it and said, this is not real, we're not going to take this seriously. And so I think the fact that they had to kidnap him speaks to the allegations and the legitimacy, the fact that there is no legitimacy or in these accusations, the fact that no other authorities, they claimed that there was an international warrant for his arrest that did not exist. If there was one, my father would not have been comfortably in Belgium or in the United States living. They would have been already arrested him. And then finally, the fact that there was no investigation into these attacks. There was no investigation. Only the Rwandan government is claiming these. And they've prepared 18 caught 18 other people that they've caught in the forest of Rwanda or the region, and are now torturing them into giving false testimonies against my father. I think part of you asked about the trial earlier, and the 3 first days, I mean, the first day of the trial, this is a whole show, essentially. The first day of the trial, there were more cameras in the room than there were lawyers. The lawyers were sitting behind the cameras. So this is all a show in the attempt to continue to smear my father. So this is the constant theme, is that they just want to make my father lose credibility, silence him, and smear him, right? And so the show trial is that first there were more cameras in the room. The lawyers were not sitting next to their clients. They were sitting behind the cameras. And then on the second day of the trial, I think I tweeted something about it. And then the second day of the trial, they were all sitting next to their lawyers, and that little hiccup was fixed. And then I think they brought in the pastor who kidnapped my father, who lured my father to Rwanda last week, and he just looked. It was a comedy show. He was like saying like, "Well, God told me to do this," and I mean, I'm a religious person as well. Don't get me wrong, but It was just so like the whole theater behind it is just there's so much nonsense, and so the whole idea is to have a show trial to smear my father, to end the fact that again, international violations, violation of international treaties, laws. He was tortured, disappeared, no legal extradition. He's being denied his lawyers. There's no. I mean, everything points to the fact that this is not legitimate. There's nothing legitimate about it. This is just Paul Kagame's desires to smear, to make my father, to lock up my father.
And people who are watching this trial or following the trial internationally, what is it that you want people to follow along? Because there's a lot of information about the trial. There's a lot of, like, as you said, falsified allegations. What in particular do you want people to really pay attention to?
Yeah, so I think in terms of one, I find them kind of a bit funny, as wrong as this is, because my father is currently, I mean, we're doing everything to save him, and we're doing everything to bring support for him. But I think this is not some of the ways that can actually make people realize how much injustice he's facing right now. But it's funny to watch the trial because it's so much of a theater. It's a show. The judges are setting the scene for the prosecution to say whatever they want. Yet when my father and his lawyers speak, somehow they're interrupted. And then the one thing to look out for, which is really interesting, but every single one of those co-accused will take any opportunity to accuse my father, to smear him. We saw this in the first day of the trial. I think Sankara, one of the co-accused, when they saw the mic was open, he ran to it and say something. So we don't know what they did to them, what they're promising them, what they're torturing them with, as we know they do this. But the whole plan is to make this is not my father and the 18 other co-accused against the state of the government, around the government. This is all of them against my father, because the government wants all of them to be against my father. And so what to look out for is those trends of the fact that they're going to be weirdly incriminating themselves in a way that they shouldn't, in the process incriminating my father just in a way that is also unnatural. The judges will facilitate a lot of their ability to speak, and will reduce my father's speaking time, and lawyers' time. And so all of these little things, I think, are telling of how much injustice he has. And also it's important to remember that he doesn't have his lawyers. They've refused. He only has access to one or two of his lawyers lawyers in Rwanda. All the other lawyers have been denied access, even though it's been done before. And so as we watch this and think there's any fairness to this, remembering that they're confiscating his privileged documents and he doesn't have access to his lawyers, is like, don't be fooled. This is a theater and not a real trial.
Hmm. Well, I think we'll definitely be following this trial. I know I I will. But I just I just want to thank you for your time today. Like I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me about the trial and about your father as well. So before I let you go, is there anything else that you would like to, or something that we haven't covered, like anything else you'd like to touch on, quickly?
Yeah, I think just two things. One thing is I know that, for instance, the Rwandan government has a huge propaganda machine meant to continue that plan to smear my father and to attack him. And so when you and when people look up Rusesabagina or go on Twitter, I mean, they have a huge Twitter propaganda machine. You will see so many people smearing my father. These are people, trolls paid by the Rwandan government to do just this. So one final message I'd have first, I encourage people to continue to repost stories about him, news articles about him, because this tells Rwanda and tells the Rwandan government that they're being watched and that they cannot hurt my father because the international community is watching. And then and I encourage you to call your representatives, to call your local representatives and ask them to ask for the freedom and to the immediate release of my father, because he's being detained illegally in Rwanda and he's being deprived of every single one of his rights. Not just my father, many other political prisoners currently in Rwanda. And then finally, I'd also encourage people. So the reason why I brought up the propaganda machine on Twitter is that I encourage you all to also post about him, because this shows, again, this sends a message to Rwanda that they are what we are watching. But then don't be shocked if you are bombarded by trolls of the Rwandan government there to smear my father and to spread lies, as they always do. And then lastly, I'd encourage people to go on Hotel Rwanda Rusesabagina Foundation.com, which is HRRFoundation.com. And this, you'll find a lot of other resources on the current government of Rwanda, my father's story, his situation, and the latest updates about the trial, and our lawyers and the international community and international advocacy and other ways to help.
Mm. Well, Carine Kanimba, just I want to thank you again so much for talking to me today. We're definitely going to be following the trial, and I just want to thank you again for your insight and taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.